Hello, hello. Welcome to today's episode. I am so excited to be here today. And we have a very special guest, and she is, in fact, our first guest on this new series that we're doing here in this community, which is called Inspiring Money Stories. So I've been talking to women in the business community, from coaching and from other, natural health practitioners and other entrepreneurs, all about their money stories, where they've overcome limiting beliefs and financial challenges, and where they've actually co-created with the universe and used manifestation to really help them progress and take a load off their shoulders as well, because we have to remember sometimes that we don't have to do it all ourselves. So today I have the wonderful LauraAura, and she is the host of the Gutsy Podcast. So thank you so much for being here today, Laura. It's wonderful to have you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Carrie.
Yeah. And I must say, I hadn't actually come across your podcast until we connected in a Facebook group recently. And I was like, oh, you sound really interesting. So I went off and had a listen. And, your power back sessions and your conversations that you have on your podcast, I've been really, really enjoying listening to them. And the laser coaching that you give on those power back sessions, I really enjoy that.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a format I adopted kind of early on. And they started off as these little 5-minute, kind of nuggets of wisdom. And the further I got into it, I was like, oh no, this is like the meat and potatoes, right? This is a chance for us to go very, very deep on a very specific subject and get some tangible ways to actually take action. So I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying them. I quite enjoy creating them.
Fantastic. Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about, who you are, what you do, a little bit about your background for those of those people in the community that don't know your work yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you the short version. I've been an entrepreneur for 16 years. I own a branding agency. That's kind of my bread and butter. That's where I started my entrepreneurial journey. That business is up and running today. She's kind of a well-oiled machine. But my focal point, where my passion is right now, is in alignment coaching for female entrepreneurs and hosting the Gutsy Podcast. So, I've always had this pull to the person that I'm working with. When I was building the branding agency, I continuously yes, I loved the branding side, but there was something about the mind of the entrepreneur that I was working with, right? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are the conversations that you're having right now? What are the emotions that you're experiencing? And about 10 years ago, I started something called the Green Couch Project, where I had entrepreneurs come into my studio, and it was a whole production. We had cameras and photographers and lighting and the whole 9 yards. And we would have just these very raw conversations about all the things that most of us are thinking and feeling, but maybe have not vocalized, maybe don't have the support system around us. Maybe we're just ready to kind of embark on a new part of our journey. And I love doing that so much, but the costs associated with that it just wasn't making sense, right? So I thought, well, how can I do more of this, but lower my investment in the production cost? Well, what if I just figured out how to launch a podcast? And so that's what I did. I just figured it out. I did some Googling. I bought a $25 headset off of Amazon. And for 4.5 years, that's how I ran and grew the Gutsy Podcast. It's a top 100 under entrepreneurship now in quite a few different countries, which I'm very proud of. I get to connect with the most brilliant women around the world. And it's just fascinating where, again, entrepreneurship is such a weird road where we often feel lonely, right? I'm the only one. What is wrong with me? And having these conversations just takes all of that off the table. And it's oh, I'm not the only one. There are other people out there like me. There are other people that have experienced this that are maybe a step or two ahead of where I am, that maybe I could lean in and learn some things from, to, grab some wisdom from, and certainly grab some inspiration from. So that's my spiel of what I'm doing in current day life.
Absolutely. And I think, you're so right, because there's a certain mindset, isn't there? And there's a certain brain, I think, maybe that goes with people who do follow that entrepreneurial path. And it's really interesting to hear that actually that you've gone from the world of branding and that you've moved into the mindset world. Because my path is kind of similar. I've done all sorts of things in my background as well. And, I've got a bit of a geeky side, as well as having a natural health and mind-body connection kind of side. And when I was doing websites for therapists, and I might do some light touch branding, but I'm not really a branding person. So often I'd say, look, you should really go out and get a branding person to do this. But the whole process of getting a website, I found it really interesting because people would shut down. It's like they think, I just buy this off the shelf. And then we actually go through the process of, well, what's your content? What are you going to put on this page? What are your photos? What's the colors and everything? And then they realize like there's so much they haven't thought about. And it hits on all their limiting beliefs and their fears of being visible, and all that stuff comes up. So it's really fascinating how the mindset and the visibility or the branding piece really goes together, actually.
I often joke and say if I could go back, I would still get a branding degree, but I would also get a psychology degree, because branding and psychology are so intertwined in so many different ways. And it's like, you wouldn't believe how like personal branding can get. And, I've had people cry in my office. I've had people completely shut down and not talk to me for 2 weeks. And it's not because like there's something wrong per se, but it's just, again, it taps back into those core beliefs, those limiting beliefs. Like what is my origin story? And it shows up because now we're exposing, right? Now we're taking up space. Now we're requesting money. Now we are, like we're putting ourselves out there. And for me to be seen and heard, hold on a second, I didn't know I signed up for that, right? So it's fascinating. And I think that that's where some of my mind body stuff started to really like, oh, interesting, right? Like I've always just been very good about leaning into the things that make me feel like excited and also curious. And that's what's led me to where we are now.
Fantastic. So you're still running your branding agency and you're doing the coaching and the podcast. So you've got the two things going side by side.
I do. Yes.
Yeah, I love it.
Yes.
Love
Well,
it.
we'll add in there as well. I also own a building, which if you're watching visually,
Yeah.
that's where I'm at as well, which we'll be renovating. It's called the Aura building, because it's all about creating a space with energy. And so yeah, I'm not bored, but it's one of those things like I've fought myself for a long time about being multifaceted and multi-passionate. Like, oh, you need to niche down, you need to focus on one thing. And some days, honestly, it would be way easier. But the second I think about letting something go, it's like it pulls me back in, but in a really good way. Like, no, remember. And so I think part of my growth has been remembering how to build a team and to have the right support and how to delegate so that I can stay in my area of awesome, so that I can continue to exude my magic in the world and what I'm supposed to do, and have the team that supports around me to execute on those things. That Laura doesn't have to do all the pieces, right? That's a story that I'm still unpacking, to be honest with you. But it's possible to be multi-passionate, but it definitely requires intention.
Can you say more about that? That's interesting.
Yeah, like
intention.
Being multi-passionate absolutely requires intention. I mean, I think anything does, right? But the intention of like, what are we doing? What is the bigger picture here? What is the goal? What is the feeling? Is this really for impact, or is this just because? And so like now I feel like I'm at the level in my life and career where like it has to have deep rooted intention and purpose. It can't just be the like, this flyby type of thing anymore, right? Like, because I have so many pieces of my puzzle moving at all given times, it's really important to make sure that there are systems and processes in place, and to make sure that there is a direction and a vision where we're all working towards. And so that intention for me is just, it's so deeply rooted that like it has to come back to the why, right? Like everything that we do, that intention always needs to check back into the why. And if it doesn't pass that test, then it's got to go, right? And
the why
that's,
test.
yes, the why test.
Love it. Yeah. And actually, I love that you brought up systems and structures as well. I heard a great quote. I was watching one of James Wedmore's videos the other day, so it might have been from him actually, that the more structure you have in the business, the more freedom that you have. And I was like, gosh, that's so true, isn't it? And that's something that we might fight as well, especially if we're creative, multi-passionate people.
Oh, absolutely.
Boxed in and have these like standard operating procedures and all this kind of stuff. But actually, that's possibly what gives you the ticket to more freedom and less time off,
I fought systems and processes for probably the first 10 years. And that's a long time, because I was like, I'm creative and I'm fluid and I want to create when I feel inspired and all this stuff. Okay, that's great and all. If it's like just you and, the circumstances are different, but, I had a team.
Mm.
They needed systems and processes. I had a roster of clients. They needed systems and processes, right? And so my bank account directly reflected my lack of structure. And it was the same with my money too, right? I'm like, "Oh, I'm a creative. I'm not a numbers person. So, we'll just charge this and it'll be fine." And I'll look at every once in a while and I'm like, "Okay, well, it turns out that's a really shitty way to do business because when you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the power." And so it was like having the back door of your house wide open in the middle of winter, trying to heat your house, and all of it's just sucking right out of the back,
Yeah.
right? So I had to get very real about like, oh, actually, understanding my numbers is powerful to me. Having systems and processes, the way that I reframed it is I look at them now like bookends, right? Like when we put books up on a shelf, we're not trying to control the books. We're just trying to make sure they don't fall over. So we put
Mm.
so we put these bookends on either side just to give them a little bit of structure. What happens in between those? Totally up to you. You can rearrange them, you can take one out, you can add one in. It's a very fluid place. And so systems and processes and structure to me are bookends.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just there to guide and to keep us going in the right direction. But what happens in between, my creativity actually gets to flourish in that space, right? Because now I'm not trying to remember all this technical stuff. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel every time. I'm not like every time something has to do it, well, nobody else can do it because Laura's the only one that knows how, right? Like that sucks your creativity right out of your butt, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
it is gone. So giving myself the bookends actually lets my creativity like skyrocket. And I'm like, oh, okay, I figured it out. Took me a little while, but I figured it out.
Nice, nice. So, what would you say are some of the top processes then or systems that you have put into place?
So, anything that is repetitive, that is done on a regular basis. So, for instance, like, okay, I'll use the podcast as an example. On the back end of a podcast, there are many of steps. Not sure if anyone listening has a podcast and is familiar, or if you're thinking about starting one, fantastic. Just know that a podcast requires process. Because from the start of like planning an episode, when it's going to air, if you have a guest, right now we're starting to involve other people in other schedules. What happens after the podcast is recorded? How do the show notes get created? How do the links get added in? Like, how does it get scheduled on social? I mean, I could go into the weeds of it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when I first launched the podcast, I had an internal team that was helping with that. But when COVID hit, I had to reabsorb every role in my company. And the podcast back end was one of them. And I very quickly was hit in the face with the things that Laura is not good at, and that is execution. That is the little pieces, right? All the things that are very important, but my brain just does not go there, right? And I will procrastinate and I put things off. And so it was that kind of time frame where I was like, okay, this really needs structure. This needs a clearer path than what it has, so that I can hand this off, so that I can teach somebody, so I can delegate it, so I can get out of the weeds. I just want to record and have great conversations and inspire people, right? I don't want to type show notes. And it's not that they're not important. It's someone else thrives on that.
Yeah.
Someone else wants nothing to do with being in front of the mic. They just want to say, give me the stuff. My area of awesome is making sure all of your stuff is in order and ready to go out to the public.
Yeah.
So, that's just kind of one example of like to have a podcast, to have a service, to have something that you're offering into the world. What is the back end ecosystem that allows you to even do that in the first place?
Absolutely. It's so true. I was talking to my cousin recently, actually, because she is a musician, but she's going into podcast production because she does all the audio engineering. She knows all this stuff. And I was like, honestly, if you ever wanted to set up a business in the world of entrepreneurs, no one really wants to learn like all of the production side of podcasting. So we were talking about that, and she couldn't quite get her head around it at first because it just comes naturally to her. And I was like, no, it's a big learning curve for a lot of people. And it's lots of steps they don't need on top of everything that they're doing. But yeah, that's interesting as well that you were saying that for you, like the execution is a struggle. And I see that as well with a lot of people. But then on the flip side, I also see the other end of the spectrum where people get so into the weeds and so into execution. It's almost like an avoidance or a procrastination strategy, because then they don't have to do the visible stuff, the money-making stuff, the stuff that might actually push them forward in the business. So, it could all be at either end of the scale for people. And either way, like outsourcing these bits and pieces that are, not money-making activities can really help us in the long run.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll also share that, because I did create my business and I do understand the process and what happens behind the scenes and how things need to happen to do the things, while execution is not my sweet spot, I'm actually weirdly good at it, right?
Yeah.
Like if I get in, I call it getting into the weeds. And so part of my work has been recognizing when I start getting sucked back into that. Because one of the stories that I, continuously am evolving from is sit down, shut up, be quiet, Laura. Nobody wants to hear you. Nobody wants to see you. And so when I start getting big and my energy starts to exude and I really start to amplify, there's a subconscious backstory part of me that's like, that's scary. Cut back, go back and do what you know how to do. We know how to handle that. We got a grasp on it. It's safe. We know that we can like make everything good there. So why don't we just do that? And it's so funny because like you're not having that conversation with yourself, right? You're just like, oh, I want to do this big thing. I have a really big goal. I want to launch a podcast. I want to speak. I want to travel the world. I want to do this big thing. And then what do you end up doing? Right?
Yeah,
like you're just like down on the keyboard.
exactly.
So it's often this very silent kind of transition. And then you're like, I can't achieve my goals. And why can't I never have time for this? And right. So it's like when you get really honest about your own stories, and I can recognize like, oh, Laura's been in the weeds for like 4 days this week. Okay, hold on. Time out. It's time to recalibrate, right? It's time to get back into alignment. Where does Laura best serve this entire operation of myself and of my business? Okay, let me continuously practice not doing that, right? So it's sneaky. It's very sneaky, but that's the work, right?
That is the work. Yeah.
That is the undoing. That is the recognizing. That is the shifting. That is like seeing it, understanding it, and choosing a different outcome instead, choosing a different action instead. So
absolutely.
I can get into some weeds for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it almost like our brain and our energy system, everything just recalibrates at that new level and that new level. So eventually, like it does feel native, it does feel safe to do things at a certain level. But whenever we're looking at growth, it feels uncomfortable. It's so normal for us to just go back to what feels safe and what's going to keep us comfortable and not visible, to that goal.
Yeah, I often say on TikTok, and it gets people real wound up, I say that the thing that you want the most is often behind the thing that you resist the most. And this is a case in point of it.
Yeah.
Right? I want the big goal. I want the next level. I want to increase my finances. I want to launch the podcast. But instead, I'm going to do these smaller tasks that make me busy so that I don't have time for that.
Yes.
That, my friend, is resistance.
Oh, 100%. Like so many people, I think pretty much everyone listening to this can identify with that. So what do you say to your clients who are in that position where they're experiencing that resistance and they keep going back into those old patterns?
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost, we have to recognize it, right? Because if we don't recognize it, if we don't have awareness around it, you just keep rolling in the hamster wheel, right? The problem just continues to show up in a different form, in a different fashion, on a different day. And so the first thing we have to do is get really, really real about, what are we resisting and why, right? Like, what is it that you truly want? And what are the tendencies that you have to pull away from it? So if we start to build awareness around that, that then becomes the work of recognizing when I start going into the weeds, when I start overpacking my schedule, when I start overcommitting, when I go offline or I'm scrolling on Instagram for 4 hours, right? Like if I can start to notice my tendencies now, that then becomes the opportunity to choose different. And so it's like very much like building a muscle, right? Like we're literally building new neural pathways in our brain because your brain, it's like, I use this analogy of a dirt road, right? Like an old country dirt road that's been there for 100 years, right? A million trucks have gone down it. The grooves in the dirt are there so that if you turn your car to go down this dirt road, you don't even think about it. Your car just kind of clicks into place, right? Because those are the grooves. Your mind is the same way. And so what we're doing with this process now is when we turn onto this dirt road, we're choosing to turn our steering wheel to the right just a little bit. And there's tension and there's pushback and your steering wheel is going to want to click over and all this stuff happens. But after doing it a few times, we start to build a new pathway. And that's where the new habit comes into play. That's where things start to get easier. That's where you really actually start to make movement, create time, have mental and physical and spiritual capacity to start to do and to receive at the same time. So it's this process. And I think that's sometimes the hard sell in the early parts of getting to know me and the work that I do, because it's not just like, it's not a quick fix, right? It's not a hack. I don't have a 5-step thing that if you just do this, then all of a sudden magically all the things that, your tendencies are just going to go away. It's really life-changing work though.
Yeah.
So if you're ready for the shift, then this type of work is really going to help guide you to all the things that you actually want.
Absolutely. And let's face it, if there was a hack or a 5-step process, everyone would be doing it and coaches would be out of business. There would not be a coaching industry, right? So that's why we're here.
It's uncomfortable, right? I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Like, who wants to wake up today and be like, you know what I want to do today? Face my tendencies.
Yeah.
Call out my own particular flavor of bullshit, right? Like, it's no one's like, woohoo, I can't wait to do that. But it's like, if you're wherever you are right now, if you're feeling called towards this, chances are you're uncomfortable, right? Something's not like in alignment in your life or in your business. So the choices are continuing every single day to relive that discomfort.
Yeah.
That doesn't go away. If we don't do anything, it stays. Or do we choose a new temporary discomfort? I say temporary because we're trying something new. We're getting out of our comfort zone. But ultimately, doing this enough times, we break those habits. We break those patterns. We free ourselves. We liberate our souls. And you get to break past that hamster wheel that you've been stuck on and actually have the thing that you want. So it's like ongoing daily discomfort, or do we shift? Do we get a little uncomfortable because we're trying something new, but we get a new outcome that actually feels way better in our body?
Absolutely. It's like, choose your version of hard. Which one would you prefer? Because it's all hard. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Speaking of hard, we were talking about your money story a little bit before, when we were kind of planning this podcast, and you had a really interesting and challenging experience. And I think, am I remembering right? It was around the start of the pandemic that you were in a quite a challenging, like, kind of money situation at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that honestly was kind of the explosion from many hard money stories that led up to it.
Right.
So
okay.
that was kind of the turning point. So growing up, I lived in a household where money was hard. Money was the root of all evil. Money made people assholes. Like, as soon as it came in, it had to leave. Every conversation around it was angry, disappointed, sad. Like, there was always these big, heavy emotions around it. And so I grew up believing that money was like this horrible thing, right? Like, oh, I don't want to feel like that. I don't want any of that, right? And so growing up, I unintentionally repeated patterns of what I was taught, right? And growing up and becoming an adult and then launching a business, spoiler alert, things don't go away when you launch a business. If anything, they get amplified. Like,
Mhm.
well, let's just shove it all right to the front, right? Like everybody in the front row. And so, how that started to look in the business was undercharging,
Mm.
was adjusting my prices to make sure that everybody felt good, because, also locking arms with the crap money story that I was given was the deep rooted fear of abandonment from people leaving. So
Right.
money and abandonment were like best friends skipping along in my life. And
Mm.
so I, in the back of my brain, connected those two things and thought, to keep people, I need to make them happy. And that means sometimes putting myself on the back burner. That means
Mhm.
sometimes lowering my prices to make sure that they get what they need. That means not cashing my own paychecks to make sure that everyone else is paid, right? Like, all of this self-sabotage, and like, oh, if I just make sure everything and everyone around me is good, then it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, my life is falling apart, right?
Mhm.
So leading up and getting to the point of the pandemic, like, I hadn't paid myself in 4 months. We had clients transitioning out, not because anything was wrong, but they were just finished. So, like, big chunks of money that were monthly reoccurring were starting to disappear. Um, Employee checks were starting to bounce, which is a
Mm.
horrific thing to own and fess up to, right? Like, absolutely terrible. My mortgage was so behind that we were starting to get notices like, hey, if you don't pay this, we're gonna have to take next steps, right? Like, everything was just like shit.
Mm.
And on
Mm.
paper, it looked like the business is doing phenomenal, and
Yeah.
in a sense it was, but financially not.
Mm.
Like, everything was working well ish. Certainly some parts that needed to be ironed out, but on paper, it looked like we were killing it.
Yeah.
My bank account said a whole different story.
Oh.
And so during the pandemic, when we had the shutdown, I had to let my entire team go. I packed up all of my stuff. I went home into my basement and I rebuilt my business over the next year.
Mm.
And, one of the first moments of sitting there, of course, like, emotions are everywhere. And I'm sitting in my basement by myself in all of this paperwork I brought my 27-inch iMac home with me, right? Like, I'm just sitting in this little tiny room with all this stuff. And I was like, wow, I am sitting in the center of what I allowed.
Wow. Yeah. Mhm.
And that's
Mm.
ownership, right? Like, in that moment, I don't think I recognized that it was what I had allowed. I was angry, right? And I was sad.
Mm.
But now I can look back and say, I was literally sitting in the center of what I allowed. This is my money story. This is my abandonment story punching me in the face right now.
Mm.
And so in that moment, I was like, okay, how do we move forward through this, right? How do we shift out? How does any of this change? Of course, I wanted it to be fixed overnight because I was super uncomfortable, but that's just not how it works. But I got this like intuitive download that said, what does Laura want? And I was like, what does Laura want? I realized I hadn't asked myself that question in probably a decade.
Mm.
I was building to make sure everyone was taken care of. I wanted to make sure everybody was happy. I wanted to, like, and yes, there were moments where I was checked back into myself, right? But as a whole, I was putting myself and my needs in the back burner, and that was not fair.
Mm. Mm.
So I was like, what does Laura want? Wow. I don't know. And so I started to lean into what that was, and I started to feel into what that meant to me. And then once I got clarity on that, then I started to run all of my decisions through that filter.
Mm.
Does this
Mhm.
align with what Laura wants? Yes, great, keep going. No, okay, shift. It's got to go. Sometimes that was clients, sometimes that was services, sometimes that were something as simple as like a social media platform that we were using, right? Like, just
Mhm.
it can really get down into a granular level. But I just started basically like readjusting. I had this box of Legos with no instructions, and I just
Mhm.
started putting pieces back together,
Yeah.
and completely changed the trajectory of where we were headed with the business. Because honestly, we were a decision away or a month away from everything. Just shut it down, redo it. I've already
Yeah.
filed bankruptcy once, so that's part
Yeah.
of my money story as well. Early on,
Yeah.
a lot of that was out of our control because of the housing market and the industry that my husband was in, and just the timing. I had just started my business. I was 6.5 months pregnant, and my husband lost his job during the
Oh,
housing market crash. So there were external circumstances, but that became part of my story, right? That became part of my nervous system. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want to go there again. So I'm like, am I going to file bankruptcy again? Like, and no shame to that, right? And especially if anybody has experienced that, no shame to it. But man, when you're in it, it feels like shame. Absolutely.
Oh, big time.
But I was like, am I really about to do this again? Am I really about to start all over? And I was like, let me give myself the opportunity to make different decisions right now, to shift the story, and let me see what I can do. Let me see what I'm capable of when I'm in alignment.
Yeah.
And that, my friend, changed everything.
Amazing. So what specifically do you think it changed? You said that being in alignment was what changed everything, but what were some of the top things that you noticed once you shifted into alignment, would you say?
Well, within 6 months, I paid off all of our debt. I completely changed our financial landscape. So that was huge, right? But I think above any tangible physical thing, I started to feel happy again.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, man, I did not
Those two
realize.
things go together, right?
I mean,
Totally.
they absolutely do, right?
Yeah.
Anybody that says money can't buy happiness is full of shit, because money honestly truly provides safety, security, flexibility, and expansion, right?
Yeah.
Nothing more than that. It's not about stuff, right? It's about the ability, right? So, but I didn't realize just how gunked up I had gotten over the years, right? I was stressed out. I had developed raging anxiety. My depression was at an all-time low, right? Like my body is like, "Hey, we're not doing good.
Yeah.
Can we do something about this?" And, the universe is a funny, fickle little thing, because it'll whisper, and then it'll tap you, and then it'll nudge you, and then it'll, hit you a little bit harder. And if you don't listen, she gets louder and stronger, and she'll punch you in the face.
Totally.
So she punched me in the face, and always with love, right? It's like, okay, you didn't listen to me the 74 times that I tried to get your attention before.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna make you move some things. So, I started to reclaim my health. I reclaimed our finances. I bought a commercial building, which was not even like, when I was in that basement, definitely not anything that I thought would be possible anytime remotely soon. But I bought this building in May of 2001. So a year after the lockdown. It was insane. And I started doing more of the things that I actually really wanted to do. Before, I didn't have time, right? Like, I was doing the podcast, but it was always like, when I have time, right? When I, forcing things in, or having to stay late, or having to come in early, or going on the weekends. And now I'm like, no, this is actually really, like, this lights me up, right? Like, this is one of my things. So having time to do the things that I really love, and then watching how that amplification has allowed us to grow in new ways, because Laura's doing what Laura's really great at. And when anybody is doing what they're great at, that exudes into the world, right? Like, that gives you that creates impact, that gives you opportunity. That is where your expansion and your growth is, right? Like, when you're doing the things that light you up, opportunities are like a magnet. Like, oh yeah, you're doing, I see, I feel, let's do things together.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. That is really, really huge. So I love that, it was really holistic as well. You're reclaiming your health, you're reclaiming your finances, you're looking at your environment, your space, like getting that commercial building, you're feeling happier, you're tending to your emotional well-being, and then you happen to also pay off the debt, surprise, surprise, that it all goes together. So yeah, amazing. And then that was really just from that shift, that power question, like, what does Laura want? And getting back into alignment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the question that I think a lot of people skip over, right? So if you're listening today and you're like, okay, I'm hearing all this, but where do you even start? Ask yourself, what do I actually want? Take out the how, take out who, take out people, take out finances, right? That we're not trying to figure anything out right now. We're just connecting back in. What do I actually want? And if you're like, I just don't know, then that's where you start. That's where you start to explore, to try some things, to what are some things that you used to love to do? What are some things that you kind of pique your interest right now? Just give yourself a chance to play, right? Like we make things so incredibly heavy and daunting and serious that it's like, I don't even want to try because that's another thing to do, right? Like, okay, we've got to shift that narrative. Like, do you want to keep doing what you're doing? I'm going to guess probably not. If you're ready to make a shift, you've got to get quiet with yourself and then give yourself the chance to play. We're not trying to perfect anything right now, right? We're just trying to find out what lights us up again.
Exactly. And it sounds like that's really the essence, isn't it? It's the playfulness, it's the fun, it's following that little path and seeing where it takes you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of, intuition. I'm hearing a lot of mindset, a lot of alignment stuff from you. So, I can appreciate that you're quite spiritual in your approach. So how, does manifestation, feature in this? Do you co-create with the universe, law of attraction in your business?
Oh my gosh, yes. Like the universe and I are like, we're friends, right? And I'm realizing that I unintentionally grabbed my water bottle that has my rose quartz in it today.
Oh, love that.
Yeah, she's a beaut.
You're definitely my kind of person. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, my husband got this for me.
Love it.
Yeah, I've been spiritual and connected to the universe for many of lifetimes. But in this particular lifetime, I can remember being a little girl and like making potions, right? Like, and I can remember going to the store and getting incense when I was a teenager, right? Like, there's all these like little things along the way that I'm like, okay, I can see it. Something that I think is super cool is my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was born in Salem, Massachusetts.
Oh, wow.
Which
Interesting.
I'm like, okay, listen, you can't make this stuff up. That's just a very cool fact. But yeah, the co-creating with the universe requires a lot of trust. But it's limitless, right? Like it's really where if you get out of your head and lean into the curiosity and the trust, anything can happen, right? So I'm a specific manifester, meaning like the more specific I can be of what I'm trying to call in, usually the easier it starts to call in. So for instance, this building, it's a 3-story commercial building, and when I was ready to transition out of the old building that I was in into a new one, I was like, someday I would love to buy a building. It's a 3-story building. It's an old building, brick in a downtown. I want to have co-working space. I want to have office space. I want to do this thing. And so this has just been playing in my head for years, right? And so when it came time to transition from my old building, I was like, what if I tapped into that? And I created a vision board, aesthetically, here's kind of what I would like to do. I'm literally talking out loud to the universe, right? Because that's how I roll. And one day I was driving home and I was like, oh, well, there's a 3-story brick building in a downtown that happens to be my downtown, by the way. I've been in this building since my great grandmother like brought me in here when it was a drugstore many, many years ago. And so I called the owner and I was like, hey, would you rent that 3rd floor for me? I would just like a new space, in my own downtown. And he's like, I don't want to be a landlord. It's not really my thing. And I was like, okay. But this nudge, I keep getting this like really intense nudge. And I was like, can I come look at the building anyways? And he was like, sure. What's the harm in that? This building was not for sale, by the way. He's fully operational in this space. And I come into the building and I had seen this building in my mind's eye and in my soul for a very long time. And when I tell you that I walked into this building and my whole body lit up, I cannot even explain what happened to me. And the clarity of what to do in here just like poured in. We looked at all 3 floors. And again, that nudge was like, tell him your vision. And I'm like, this man already thinks I'm nuts. And it was like, tell him your vision. So I told him my vision. And 3 or 4 days later, I emailed him and said, it would be an honor to buy your building. Would you sell it? And he was like, Yeah. Yeah, I would. I want to be a part of making
Mm,
sure that that vision comes to life. Without me knowing, on his side, he had been praying for what his next step with this building was. He was coming to a place where something needed to happen, or he was ready to do something. And then I literally show up in his world and say, "Can I buy it?" So,
I love that.
that's just a very simple, not really simple. Buying a building is a big deal, but even down to, I knew I wanted to call it the Aura building. And
Mm.
when we brought our son back to look at the space, we were on the third floor just looking around, and he was like, "Mommy, did you see the box that says Aura on it?" And I was like, "Are you shitting me right now?" I turn around and they had been collecting, just like trash and stuff. They were cleaning it out in preparation for the sale. And it was this 4 foot tall box that said Aura on all four sides.
Amazing.
So when I tell you, when I get specific, that
Mm,
I've learned that that is kind of my flavor of manifestation. Is the more
yeah.
clear that I can get, the more clear that I feel, the easier it just, like, that wasn't planned, right?
No.
And I think that that's the thing about manifestation, is sometimes we think that, like, well, if I just sit and plan it out, right? If I map it out, if I force it out, if I, even journal it out, which is a great place to start, but like, that plan, if you're flexible with the how it comes into your world, I
Mm,
think that that's where we open up to receive. Because when we try to
yeah.
control how it happens, when we try to control the timing,
Mm,
that's when friction comes. The universe is like, "Okay, I thought you trusted me.
yeah.
I thought we were gonna do this. Okay,
Totally,
when you
totally.
when you're done trying to tell me what to do, then I'll be back." Right?
Yeah, it's like conditional manifesting, really, isn't it? It's like only if, it comes in this way, then I will accept it. When actually, if we just really open up, it's like I'm open to many ways, any way that this could come to me. I wonder. And then we
Yes.
get to see some real magic like you experienced. And I mean, is that not a sign? That is just insane, isn't it? Like a box with aura on it in that
I
building.
I'm telling, like, I just bawled. I just cried. I broke
Yeah.
down because I'm like, if there if I needed any form of confirmation that I'm doing the right thing,
Mm,
physically, literally sitting in front of me right now, there you are. Right? And
yeah.
so I'm like, this is my building. This is the one that
Yeah.
I sketched on paper like 4 years ago.
Amazing. I love that you talk about that specificity. I always have trouble pronouncing that word, but
That's quite a word.
specificity. Yes. Because, I talk about that a lot and I feel like I bang on about it a bit. But what I see people doing with manifestation is there's a lot of wishful thinking, like, yeah, I'd love more money and more abundance and more freedom. And then, the universe might give you $1 and you find it on the street and it's like, tick that box, more money, there you go. And actually, we really need to get really rich with our ideas around this, and also like what is that money actually going to give us. So for in your example, it can be like, I could fund a building. I could actually purchase a building to work in one day, and then having that building in your mind as well as that money goal, it just brings such a rich picture into your mind, and it's so much easier then to step into that vibration, I think, on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that that is part of the work too, is like allowing yourself to feel what that feels like, right? So that thing that you're calling in, that thing that you're desiring, the thing that you're manifesting, are you able and willing to feel what it feels like to already have it,
Mm,
right? Like, can you like literally sit still for a second and feel into, like, what does it look like? What does it smell like? What does the textures feel like, right? Like, what
mm,
am I doing in in my day? What am I doing in my life? Like, really, like, embodying as if it's already here. I have found to be an incredible, like, amplifier, because it's like, oh, yeah, like,
mhm.
if nothing else, a confirmation of, like, this feels good, right?
Yeah,
Like, I wanna feel like
yeah,
that more often, which
yeah.
opens you up to receiving more, at baseline. But it also just opens up and it tells the universe, like, okay, now we're co-creating here, right? The universe is doing its thing on the back end to pull in the right opportunities. And here you are on earth embodying that feeling.
Mm,
Now we're co-creating, my friend. Now we're working together. You're not trying to control what's happening and when it's happening.
yeah.
Rather, you are calling it in. So that combination, whew, that's yummy stuff, right? Like that's really where
Yeah.
some magic can happen.
Yeah, I love that distinction. Like you're not forcing it, you're not creating it, you're calling it in. It's like you're inviting it, you're open, you're receiving. Yeah, beautiful. So I'm curious to know if there's someone who is in a similar situation to where you were at, actually. Like it sounds like quite a dire straight situation, like how did you describe it? Your money and abandonment story punching you in the face. I thought that was such a powerful quote.
I mean,
Yeah.
it was doing it.
Yeah. I mean, if someone finds themselves literally in that space where it's like, oh my God, like money is just like going out left, right, and center. I don't know what to do. I'm not like enjoying what this thing is. I want to do something different. I don't know what to do. What would be your top piece of advice for someone in that scenario?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to send you some love because I know what that feels like. I know still a familiar feeling, right? I don't know that it ever goes away. It just shifts, and you become better equipped on how to handle it moving forward. Take a big deep breath for you there. What I say for you right now is to give yourself a chance to pause.
Mm.
And I know that that seems really counterproductive, especially if you're like running around with your hair on fire. That's, if you are, all the more reason why you need to stop just for a second, right?
Mm.
Go somewhere outside of where you're typically trying to fix this, right? And get out of your house, get out of your office, get out of your car, wherever it is that you're typically trying to like, oh man, I need to fix this. And if I just do that, and then I can do that, and then I can shift over here, right? Like that frantic energy. I'm asking you to set it up on a shelf right now, right? And go pause and start to tap back into yourself. And this again is the work, right? Because that frantic energy might feel like you're fixing things. It's like throwing lighter fluid on a bonfire, right? So if we can pause for a second and get out of that frantic energy, get grounded back in your body, what is logically now one next step that I can take to start to shift this? Because that's getting back into your line body. That's getting back into your grounded body. And when we make decisions from that space, we're more strategic, we're more intentional, we are more embodied. And from there, now you're making sound decisions to start shifting things. And whether that's, handling finances, whether that's starting to explore what your next step is for your career, because if you're doing one thing, but you want to be doing something else, there are steps that happen, right? But when we are silent and still, then we can receive information. Because when you're in that like keyboard warrior, I'm going to fix everything, you cannot receive, right? You're basically repelling it. There's a big shield around you where it's like hail hitting it and it's just bouncing right off.
Yeah.
Right. But in that stillness and that connection, you can receive clarity. You can receive guidance on what your next step is. And from there, if that's the process that you continue to take, you will start to relieve all of that. I promise you.
I love that. That's really powerful. And essentially, it sounds like what you're saying as well with that is, taking that power back, because it's such a disempowering place when we're in that situation, and it feels like, because the finances are in a state, and because your work or lack of work is in a state, and it feels like you don't have a lot of power in that position. So that's taking all your power back, and like, what can I do to start shifting this? And you're back in the driver's seat then, actually.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
It's why I built the podcast with every Thursday with power back episodes.
Yeah.
Just little nuggets of ways for you to start to reclaim yourself. We unintentionally give away pieces and parts of us on a regular basis. And so all I'm asking you to do is to start to reclaim those one at a time. And, if you do that enough times, then everything in your world starts to shift.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. And one more question is, what would be your top manifestation tip for someone who wants to co-create with the universe and create a business like you have? What would you say to them?
I would say find what feels good to you, because look, I could go on the internet and find 8 million ways to learn how to manifest right now. Right. And I think experimenting and trying some things, but ultimately you have to do the thing that works and feels good for you, right? Because the way I manifest is likely different than the way that you do, which is likely different than the way that our friends do, right? Like it's such a personal journey. So don't beat yourself up if one certain way doesn't feel right to you, and now you're not sticking to it, and now you're not doing it, and now you're frustrated because manifestation doesn't work, right? Like that's kind of the domino effect. So play with these different techniques, play with different things, try it out, see what sticks for you. Because when it is for you, it becomes very evident very, very quickly. Because it's like it feels easy, it feels enjoyable. It doesn't feel like another thing to do. It feels like part of your practice, part of your life. I'm not a big fan of the word routine personally, just because for me, it feels like I'm putting things in boxes, but part of like your daily journey, we'll call it, like for me, I talked about getting specific, but also for me at the end of the day, grounding, like physically feet on the ground, grounding is a really powerful tool for me. It's almost like plugging back in and releasing what wasn't mine for the day and gathering new stuff for the next day. But that's probably not for everybody, right? And that's okay. So give yourself a chance to play and figure out what is for you. And know that it doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't need to be complicated. You don't need to buy anything. You can literally manifest sitting in your chair right now. So it can be simple and enjoyable and fold right into your daily stuff.
Love that. I love that. Thank you so much for your time today. So if anyone's interested in your work and they're curious about what you do, where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, if you go to LauraAura.com, it's LauraAura.com. That's the hub for all things me. You can find links to the Gutsy Podcast is on there. It has links to my social media. I play the most on TikTok. So if you're a TikToker, I'm at that LauraAura. Come say hi and let me know that you heard me on this show. And you can also learn about my different classes and courses and coaching on LauraAura.com as well.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, this is the kind of conversation I live for. So thanks for holding the space for us to have it.
You are very welcome. All right. See you later.